Hi everyone, and welcome back to another devlog for my indie retro RPG. In the last devlog, I did some work on enemy AI. I got it to a point that I was happy with. So at this point, I have a character who can do basic attack on enemies, and enemies that can do a basic attack on the player. That's a good base, but I want my game's combat to have a variety of abilities. So in this devlog, I'll go through the types of combat abilities you can use and how I implemented them. If you've ever seen the introduction to this devlog series, you'll know that the big influences for this game are the first few Dragon Quest games and EverQuest. I was a massive fan of EverQuest back in the day, spending every waking hour either playing the game or thinking about the game. I really liked the different abilities the game used, and so most of the abilities I'm putting into my game are based on the types of abilities in EverQuest. These are the types of abilities that I've decided to put into my game. First, direct damage. So any ability that does damage a single time to a single enemy. This is what I'm using for both spells and melee attacks with weapons. Second, damage over time. This is any ability that does damage slowly over a period to a single enemy. Third, area of effect. This is a direct damage spell that affects all the enemies on the screen. Fourth, buffs. These are abilities you can use on yourself to increase your stats or damage during battle. Fifth, debuffs. These are abilities you can use on enemies to decrease their stats or damage during battle. Sixth, cures. These are abilities that will remove damage over time abilities. And seventh, nullifications. These are interesting abilities because they serve a dual purpose. If you use a nullification on yourself, they remove a harmful debuff. If you use it on an enemy, it removes a beneficial buff. I decided to tackle each one of these one by one. The direct damage abilities were pretty easy to get working, since it's pretty much just performing a single calculation and subtracting a number from an enemy's health. I worked on dots next, and these were a bit trickier to get working correctly because they involved more than just calculating numbers. What I did was make it so that each dot you or the enemy casts is actually its own timer node that gets created. Every time the timer expires, it sends a signal to deal damage to the target. After a set number of expirations, the timer destroys itself to mark the end of the dot effect. After doing dots, I decided to take on buffs and debuffs next. They have a lot in common with dots because they affect the target instead of just doing a damage calculation. I ended up giving the player and every enemy its own set of arrays for dots, buffs, and debuffs to track what effects are on a target at any given time. As dots, buffs, and debuffs are cast, cured, or nullified, I can add or remove them from the arrays and update the visuals based on what's populated in the arrays. I tackled cures and nullifications together too, since they work in much the same way. Now that I had the arrays for each target to track the effects that are affecting it, I can perform checks when a cure or nullification is cast to see if there are any active effects in those arrays and remove them. Finally, I took care of implementing area of effect. This was actually really simple since it's just doing the same thing as a direct damage, but on every enemy on the screen. Alright, so I had all these abilities working, and I sat back, took a sip of coffee, felt really good about myself. But I still felt like things were missing. One idea I had while I was implementing all these abilities was for secondary effects. For example, one of the test abilities I created as I was implementing this stuff was a fireball spell. It's a straightforward direct damage attack. But what if it had a secondary effect of lowering fire resistance or destroying armor or leaving a dot on the target? This is nothing groundbreaking. Lots of games have this sort of thing, and it's something I really like because it lets you add a lot of strategy to using abilities. So I went back into my ability database and added a special effect variable to all of my abilities and created a few to test it out. So I made the aforementioned fireball spell that also reduces fire resistance. I made a test physical attack that does direct damage and then also leaves a long, weak damage over time on the target. And I made a direct damage that does damage, but then it acts as a life tap to heal the caster for a portion of the attack's damage. So I'm really excited to play around with some of these and make kind of combination abilities instead of just single-use abilities. I was really happy with where the ability system was, but not quite fully content. Going back to my inspiration of EverQuest, one of my favorite types of character to play was a pet class, like Magician, Necro, if you've ever played EverQuest. So now that I've implemented all of these different abilities into my game, why not try to make one more ability that will allow you to summon a pet? So the actual summoning of the pet was pretty easy to get working. What I had a hard time with was getting it so the pet could use all the same abilities and be affected by the same abilities as the enemy and the player. And then I needed to make sure that the enemies and the player could use abilities on the pet, such as buffing and curing and debuffing. I had to implement a threat system as well, so that the enemies would be able to decide if they should target the player or the pet. And it ended up being a lot more involved than I thought it would be. I'm not a great coder, and if you go back and watch my intro video, I kind of go through my experience, which is very little. But I knew my code wasn't super efficient. And as I was adding the pet, I realized just how inefficient it was. I found myself spending a lot of time going back through my functions to make sure that they would work with the pet as well as with the player and the enemy. And I had and still have quite a bit of redundancy in my code. And maybe in the future, I'll kind of go through and streamline things. But it took a while, but eventually I got it working. And now I can have abilities to summon a variety of pets that can assist you in battle. So although the battle system is pretty functional at this point, you can load in, you can use a variety of abilities to attack enemies, and you can defeat the enemies. It's still missing a huge part that will make it an RPG, and that is stats. All while I was implementing these abilities and doing all these tests, I'd mostly been using dummy numbers. So for an attack, I would just put in how much damage I wanted the attack to do. It wasn't being calculated where it was based on strength or intelligence or anything like that. So that's the next thing that I plan to tackle, was to add in some of these statistics, make the damage numbers a little more natural, add some variability so that damage will be in a range. So instead of always doing, for example, 12 damage with an attack, it might do somewhere between 11 and 14 damage, depending on your stats and some randomness. So stay tuned for the next video, and I'll go over those stats, show how they're going to affect combat. Don't forget to like and subscribe to see more of these devlogs. Thanks for watching.